On April 7, 1982, a collective of ordinary inhabitants within a Washington, D.C. apartment complex made a pivotal choice that positioned them directly against Soviet intelligence and the FBI. The contents discovered behind the door of apartment 4F would starkly illustrate their naivety regarding the clandestine world of espionage and compel them to face an unprecedented dilemma. When confronted with a situation where inaction is detrimental and your own government instructs you to cease, what course of action do you take? Their chosen path would irrevocably alter their circumstances. In the early morning hours of February 13, 1982, Margaret Chen stood in the corridor outside her dwelling at 1847 16th Street Northwest, gazing at a portal that had remained shut for over half a year. The building, a 6-story brick edifice erected in 1957, contained 36 residences, primarily occupied by middle-ranking government officials, journalists, and emerging professionals. Margaret, a research librarian at the Library of Congress, had been a resident of apartment 4B for 3 years. Yet apartment 4F, situated directly across the hall, had evolved into a profound mystery. The tenant identified himself as David Thorne. He had taken occupancy in July of 1981, prepaid 6 months' rent in cash, and had been observed on no more than a dozen occasions since. He consistently appeared alone, always with a briefcase, and invariably evaded engaging in conversation. The building's superintendent, Frank Delgado, recalled that his application was processed without any complications, and the management company swiftly granted approval. Despite this, an unsettling feeling persisted. Thomas Bradley, residing in 4E, reported hearing peculiar mechanical noises emanating from the adjacent wall during late nights, sounds akin to fans or motors operating on an erratic schedule. Janet Kowalski, from 5F, lodged a complaint regarding a substantial degradation in her television reception since the summer, experiencing interference patterns that baffled her repair technician. Frank himself noted that the electrical meter indicative of 4F displayed a consumption rate far exceeding that of any comparable unit, usage that seemed implausible for a dwelling that ostensibly remained vacant for extended periods. February 1982 marked a period of heightened tension in the Cold War. Ronald Reagan had been in office for slightly over a year, adopting a more confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union compared to his predecessor. The discourse between Washington and Moscow had seen a steady escalation, and Soviet intelligence operations within the United States were undergoing expansion. Although the full extent of these activities would not come to light for many years, Washington presented a highly attractive target. The concentration of governmental agencies, defense contractors, and media outlets rendered it an invaluable asset for foreign intelligence services. The FBI's counterintelligence division maintained continuous surveillance over known Soviet operatives, but the Soviets had adapted, shifting towards sophisticated technical surveillance and communication interception methods rather than the crude tactics of prior decades. Margaret was unaware of any of this as she stood in the hallway that morning. The door to apartment 4F was slightly ajar, and through the narrow aperture, she could discern furniture deliberately positioned to obstruct the interior view. More alarming was the odor. The scent of heated electronics mingled with stagnant air, suggesting the apartment had been sealed for weeks. It was then that she observed something through the gap that caused her to halt. Heavy-duty industrial power cables, the type typically employed for electric stoves or welding equipment, were affixed to the floor within the apartment. They appeared to originate in what she presumed was the kitchen area and extended all the way towards the bedroom. These thick orange cables seemed entirely out of place in a standard residential unit. The scene felt intrinsically wrong in a way she couldn't immediately articulate, but the image imprinted itself upon her mind as she retreated from the door and proceeded to her own unit. By that afternoon, Margaret had convened a small gathering in the building's lobby. Thomas and Ellen Bradley, both practicing attorneys, joined her, as did Janet Kowalski and Robert Harrison from apartment 3F, an analyst at the State Department, alongside Frank Delgado, the building's superintendent. They shared their observations, and the composite picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. Thomas provided a more precise description of the sounds, noting their peak occurrence between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., characterized by a rhythmic cadence resembling machinery. However, an additional element troubled him for weeks. Occasional sounds of furniture being moved, heavy dragging noises that vibrated through the floor. Yet these were never accompanied by any visible activity in the hallway. It was as if the apartment were being reconfigured in the dead of night, yet no one ever seemed to be present. Janet further detailed the television interference, explaining it manifested as horizontal bars that became more pronounced during evening hours. Robert, who had been listening intently, introduced a piece of information that shifted the entire dynamic. Approximately 3 weeks prior, on January 19th, he had observed David Thorne entering the building, accompanied by another man, both carrying substantial equipment cases. Thorne had appeared startled, almost panicked, and hastened past without acknowledgement. Robert, whose professional focus involved analyzing Soviet communications for the State Department, recognized a lapel pin worn by Thorne's companion as insignia associated with a Soviet cultural organization. Individually, each detail was inconsequential. However, when juxtaposed with Thorne's reaction, it registered as highly unusual. Over the subsequent 3 days, the residents discreetly surveyed the building. Their concerns resonated with many of their neighbors. Dorothy Patterson in 2F reported hearing peculiar clicking sounds on her telephone, particularly during conversations with her son, who was employed at the Pentagon. Michael Chen noted the presence of unfamiliar vehicles parked across the street for extended periods, consistently positioned to offer a clear view of the building's entrance. Carl Winters in 4D revealed that he had once observed Thorne departing at 2:00 a.m., while carrying what appeared to be reels of magnetic tape. By February 16th, they had compiled a disquieting list. Apartment 4F exhibited all the hallmarks Robert had described as indicative of a potential surveillance post: minimal human occupancy, elevated electrical consumption, anomalous interference, suspicious visitors, and a tenant whose conduct suggested a preoccupation with operational security. The critical question then became, what steps should be taken? Robert proposed contacting the FBI. The Bureau had intensified its focus on Soviet espionage following several prominent arrests, and the Washington field office held jurisdiction over counterintelligence matters. On February 17th, Robert initiated the call. The conversation with the FBI resulted in a courteous but non-committal response. Special Agent Collins listened, posed clarifying inquiries, and stated that the information would be forwarded for review, with a vague promise of contact if an investigation was deemed necessary. No commitment to action was made, and no sense of urgency was conveyed. The group reconvened, feeling frustrated but understanding that the FBI handles a multitude of tips and must meticulously prioritize. They resolved to maintain their surveillance while awaiting a formal response. On February 21st, Janet encountered a man in the hallway who introduced himself as Thorne's brother, visiting from Toronto. He was affable and courteous, a stark contrast to Thorne's demeanor. However, Janet observed that his keychain bore at least a dozen keys, far exceeding the number required for a casual apartment visit. As he opened the door to apartment 4F, she caught a fleeting glimpse inside before he swiftly closed it. What she saw contradicted any notion of it being a conventional residence. Racks of electronic equipment, reminiscent of a radio station, with multiple devices displaying illuminated dials, cables strewn across the floor, some form of antenna configuration against the far wall, and what appeared to be reel-to-reel tape recorders. The glimpse lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but it unequivocally confirmed that apartment 4F was not being utilized as a dwelling. Frank Delgado meticulously examined the building's records. The lease agreement listed Thorne's employer as Dalton Trading Company in Ottawa. Frank attempted to contact the provided number, only to discover it was disconnected. The references included a landlord in Toronto and an employer in Montreal. The Toronto number rang incessantly without answer, and the Montreal number connected to a business that had no record of David Thorne or the company he purportedly represented. Robert contacted the FBI once more, furnishing additional details. He was informed that the report was under review and that the FBI would respond if an investigation was deemed necessary. Still, there was no assurance of action or a defined timeline. The bureaucratic response mirrored broader systemic challenges within U.S. intelligence and law enforcement during that era. Congressional investigations in the 1970s had brought numerous abuses to light, leading to reforms that imposed stricter oversight and elevated standards for initiating investigations. While these changes were essential, they inadvertently created scenarios where credible intelligence could be overlooked due to bureaucratic inefficiencies or delays stemming from multi-tiered approval processes. The residents found themselves caught within this systemic gap. Their observations were detailed and credible, and Robert's professional background lent them significant weight. However, in the absence of direct evidence of an immediate threat, their case competed for limited resources against scores of other ongoing investigations. Frustrated by the perceptible lack of official engagement, the residents made a decision that would propel them into perilous territory. They would undertake their own investigation, amassing sufficient evidence to compel law enforcement intervention. The unofficial inquiry commenced on February 22nd with a planning session held at Thomas and Ellen Bradley's residence. The core group resolved to meticulously observe and document all aspects pertaining to apartment 4F, creating an evidentiary record that could be presented to law enforcement as irrefutable proof. Carl Winters, a freelance photographer, established camera equipment at his apartment window, affording a clear vantage point of the building's entrance. Margaret Chen and Janet Kowalski organized a surveillance schedule, assigning residents to monitor the fourth-floor hallway. Michael Chen, an electrical engineer employed by a defense contractor, installed a spectrum analyzer in Janet's apartment to detect electromagnetic emissions. The first significant observation occurred on the February 24th at 11:47 p.m., when Thomas Bradley heard sounds emanating from apartment 4F that were more distinct than usual. Through the wall, he clearly discerned voices. Though hushed and indistinct, they were undeniably human speech. For a span of 20 minutes, these vocalizations persisted, punctuated by intermittent mechanical noises reminiscent of a tape recorder, activating and deactivating repeatedly. Robert Harrison grasped the implication instantly. The auditory cues aligned with the operational profile of an intelligence signal, specifically the kind associated with capturing and archiving communications. The spoken words could very well have been intercepted telephone conversations or radio transmissions being replayed for analytical purposes. Michael Chen's technical assessment corroborated this hypothesis. The detected electromagnetic emissions exhibited patterns consistent with numerous devices functioning concurrently: radio receivers, recording equipment, and signal processing units. Critically, Michael identified emissions matching the frequencies utilized by U.S. government communication systems. He pinpointed equipment operating within the 148-174 MHz federal bands, spectral ranges designated for governmental use and inaccessible to standard civilian receivers. The signal characteristics suggested the deployment of panoramic receivers capable of comprehensively scanning entire frequency ranges simultaneously, technology far exceeding the capabilities of any amateur radio enthusiast. By March 28th, a substantial body of evidence had been amassed. This included 47 distinct observations of unusual activity, each meticulously time-stamped. Photographic evidence captured 3 different individuals entering the apartment, none of whom matched Thor's description. Technical analyses confirmed the presence of equipment capable of intercepting government communications. Furthermore, electricity consumption patterns showed pronounced surges coinciding with extended operating hours at government facilities, implying targeted surveillance. The most compelling piece of evidence was obtained when Frank briefly intercepted the apartment's March telephone bill from the lobby mailbox before discreetly returning it. The itemized statement revealed regular long-distance calls to a New York number identified by Robert as belonging to the Soviet mission to the United Nations. These calls were placed approximately every 3 days in the evening, suggesting a consistent reporting schedule. Robert initiated another call to the FBI on March 29th, requesting an in-person meeting instead of submitting another telephonic report. He was informed that a representative from the Washington field office would contact him to arrange an appointment. As of March 31st, no such contact had been made. The group reconvened that evening, their initial frustration having transmuted into resolute determination. Several courses of action were deliberated: contacting media outlets, approaching different agencies, or the most drastic option, entering apartment 4F themselves to document its contents and confront law enforcement with irrefutable evidence. Frank highlighted that, as the building superintendent, he possessed legal access to all apartments for emergency situations. Ellen Bradley strongly advised against this, emphasizing that any evidence procured through unauthorized entry would likely be deemed inadmissible and could expose them to criminal prosecution. Frank countered that their objective was not evidence for prosecution, but to compel a proper investigation. The debate persisted for 2 hours. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. They would wait an additional week for the FBI's response. If no action had been taken by April 7th, they would reconsider a direct entry. This decision stemmed from both their exasperation and a profound sense of civic responsibility, a choice that would soon place them at odds with both Soviet intelligence and the established protocols of their own government. The week spanning March 31st to April 7th unfolded with escalating tension. The surveillance activities persisted. Carl documented photographs of 4 additional visitors, including one individual arriving in a vehicle bearing New York license plates. When Robert relayed this information to the FBI on April 5th, he received the customary response of information under review and an assurance that someone would be in contact requesting patience. Michael's continuous technical monitoring revealed intensified activity, with equipment operating at higher power levels and for extended durations. On April 4th, his analyzer detected brief, high-powered radio transmissions lasting mere seconds, bursts of compressed data transmitted on high-frequency bands. This pattern was consistent with burst transmission technology, a method designed for transmitting intelligence reports in a manner that renders the signals exceptionally difficult to intercept or triangulate. On April 6th, an event occurred that pushed them to their limit. Dorothy Patterson, the 72-year-old resident diligently maintaining their logbook, received a telephone call from an unidentified man with an Eastern European accent. While not overtly threatening, he clearly indicated his awareness of their activities. He specifically mentioned that older residents should exercise caution when involving themselves in matters beyond their understanding, and that unfortunate accidents could befall anyone. The call lasted less than a minute, but its implication was unambiguous. Dorothy, though shaken, reported the incident to the group immediately. Several residents had observed unfamiliar men in the building in recent days, individuals who claimed to be visiting other tenants but whose presence felt incongruous. The realization that they themselves might be under surveillance transformed the situation from an abstract investigation into something immediate and personal. The group convened an emergency meeting that evening. Robert reported his final attempt to contact the FBI, this time by calling the Soviet counterintelligence section directly. He spoke with Special Agent James Mitchell, who appeared familiar with the case and confirmed the FBI's awareness of Apartment 4F and their ongoing investigation. Mitchell urged Robert to discontinue amateur surveillance efforts, explaining that civilian involvement could jeopardize their operation. When Robert pressed him regarding the delay, Mitchell's response was carefully calibrated. The Bureau, he clarified, was not merely observing a single apartment. They were tracking an entire network. Moving too swiftly against 4F, he asserted, could alert other elements they were attempting to identify. They were awaiting something or someone, though Mitchell declined to specify further details. This information, intended to be reassuring, instead generated more questions. If the FBI was investigating, why had the residents not been informed? Why had the perceived operation been allowed to continue for so long? And if they were aware of 4F, did they also know about the group's surveillance? Was this the reason for Dorothy's threatening phone call? The discussion circled for an hour. Some advocated for ceasing all activity and trusting the FBI. Others insisted they had already committed too significantly to retreat. The threat against Dorothy could be classified as witness intimidation, a federal offense in itself. Margaret Chen finally articulated what many were contemplating. They had reached a juncture where continued passive surveillance was both perilous and unproductive. The FBI supposedly possessed knowledge and was managing the situation, yet the operation persisted. Residents were receiving threats, and no discernible action was being taken. A vote was held. Among the 14 residents actively involved, the outcome was close, with 8 supporting direct and immediate action. The plan was finalized for the following evening, April 7th. Teams were rapidly organized. Frank Delgado was to use his master key to access the apartment, accompanied by Michael Chen and Carl Winters. Michael would document the technical equipment, Carl would systematically photograph all findings, and Frank would provide legal justification as a building emergency. Robert Harrison, Thomas Bradley, and Janet Kowalski would serve as lookouts. Margaret Chen and Ellen Bradley would remain in Margaret's apartment with a telephone, prepared to contact the police if necessary. April 7, 1982, a Wednesday, was selected because surveillance had indicated minimal activity in apartment 4F on weekday evenings. The entry was planned for 7 p.m., early enough to utilize natural light, but late enough for most residents to have returned from work. The day progressed with mounting anxiety. At 2:30 p.m., Janet Kowalski contacted Margaret Chen with urgent news. While monitoring from her apartment, she observed a black sedan with New York plates pull up across the street. Two men remained inside for nearly 40 minutes, their attention fixed on the building's entrance. One appeared to be taking photographs. The vehicle departed at 3:15 p.m. At 4 p.m., Thomas Bradley reported hearing activity within apartment 4F for the first time in days. Sounds of movement, footsteps, and what might have been furniture being rearranged. The timing was unsettling. Had their operation been compromised? Were the Soviets aware of the residents' intentions? Was someone currently present in the apartment? Robert Harrison convened an emergency meeting. The group faced a critical decision: proceed as planned or abort the mission given the indications of active surveillance. The debate was intense. Ellen Bradley vehemently argued that the heightened activity served as a clear warning that should be heeded, and that proceeding at this juncture would be reckless. Carl Winters countered that the activity might signify the opposite, that the operators were preparing to dismantle the facility and disappear, making this their final opportunity to gather evidence. At 5:47 p.m., the debate was interrupted by a knock on Robert's door. Everyone froze. Robert approached cautiously and peered through the peephole. It was Frank Delgado, his expression one of alarm. He had just encountered a man in the building's basement near the electrical room. This individual had no legitimate reason to be there and claimed to be from the power company, despite arriving in an unmarked vehicle and carrying no identification or tools. When Frank pressed him, the man departed abruptly without completing any supposed inspection. The coincidences were accumulating too rapidly. Surveillance across the street, activity in 4F after days of silence, and now a mysterious visitor in the basement. Margaret voiced the thought occurring to several others. Perhaps they should contact the FBI one final time, explain the developing situation, and allow the professionals to handle it, even if it meant further delays. However, Robert Harrison had reached a decision. He informed the group that he would proceed independently if required, contending that the heightened activity coupled with surveillance indicated the operation was entering a crucial stage. He further stated that delaying any longer could result in forfeiting their sole chance. One by one, the other members reaffirmed their commitment. They had invested too much to retreat now. By 6:30 p.m., the team was in position, although the prevailing atmosphere was distinctly different from their expectations earlier that day. Every sound in the corridor appeared magnified. Every shadow seemed suspect. Frank had prepared a plausible story about electrical issues necessitating an emergency inspection of all units on the 4th floor, yet his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he organized his keys. Michael and Carl arrived separately, their equipment concealed in nondescript bags, both keenly aware of the black sedan that had been observing the building for hours prior. At 6:45 p.m., Robert placed a final call to the FBI, reaching Agent Mitchell directly. He explained that newly uncovered evidence demanded immediate attention. Robert detailed the threatening phone call, the increased satellite activity, and the surveillance they had witnessed that afternoon. A pause ensued on the line, longer than before. When Mitchell spoke again, his tone had shifted. He inquired about Robert's current location and whether any residents were planning to take action that evening. A chill ran down Robert's spine. Mitchell knew. Somehow, the FBI was privy to their plan. Mitchell's subsequent words confirmed his suspicions. In his capacity as a federal agent, he strongly advised against any civilian attempt to enter apartment 4F. The FBI was fully aware of the increased activity and was managing the situation. He cautioned that any interference at this juncture could jeopardize an ongoing federal investigation and potentially endanger lives. Robert directly questioned when the FBI intended to intervene. Mitchell replied that he could not divulge operational specifics, but emphasized the critical importance of civilians ceasing all activity immediately. He explained that the operation in 4F was more intricate than the residents understood, and what appeared to be an immediate action was, in reality, a meticulously coordinated effort. Robert ended the call, The response was neither what he desired nor what he had anticipated. The FBI's warning was explicit, urgent, and delivered precisely when the residents were poised to act. At 6:52 p.m., Robert convened the lookouts in the hallway and relayed the FBI's warning. Janet advocated for immediate withdrawal. Thomas appeared hesitant, but Frank, who had positioned himself near the door of 4F, reported something that decisively influenced their choice. He could discern rapid voices inside the apartment, conversing in what sounded like Russian, accompanied by the noises of equipment being moved. He surmised that if the Soviets were preparing to depart, they had mere minutes, not hours. At 6:55 p.m., fully cognizant that they were disregarding a federal agent's direct caution, Robert gave the signal to advance. Frank Delgado inserted his master key into the lock of apartment 4F. The mechanism turned effortlessly, and the door swung inward without resistance. Michael Chen and Carl Winters followed him inside. What they observed in the ensuing 30 seconds would validate every suspicion the residents had harbored over the past month. The unit was not a residential apartment at all. It was entirely devoid of people. All conventional furnishings had been removed or pushed against the walls. In the central area, 6 equipment racks were arranged in 2 parallel rows, each laden with electronic devices that emitted a symphony of hums and clicks with mechanical precision. Reel-to-reel tape recorders, at least 8 in number, were housed within the racks, some in operation, others idle, their substantial spools visible through transparent covers. An entire rack was dedicated to radio receivers, their dials casting a soft amber and green glow, tuned to various frequencies. Another rack contained signal processors and amplifiers, their meters flickering as they monitored incoming transmissions. On the floor near the equipment racks sat a cassette player connected to large subwoofers and transducers, devices designed to transmit vibrations through solid structures. The playing tape contained a continuous loop. However, it wasn't merely spoken words. It was what intelligence professionals would later characterize as a, quote, nauzgu. This was a meticulously engineered recording, encompassing footsteps of varying weights and paces, the sounds of drawers opening and closing, chairs scraping across floors, and fragments of casual conversation. The transducers directly conveyed these sounds into the building structure, providing residents in adjacent units and those below with vibrations consistent with normal human activity. It was an advanced form of audio camouflage, crafted to sustain the impression of occupancy even when the apartment was empty. Carl immediately commenced photographing, his camera shutter a rapid percussion as he documented every detail, the flash-illuminated cables traversing the floor in organized bundles, each clearly marked with tags bearing Cyrillic inscriptions. The heavy-duty power cables Margaret had glimpsed through the doorway extended from the kitchen's 220-volt stove outlet all the way to the bedroom, supplying the substantial electrical power required for the transmission equipment. Michael examined the equipment racks, noting their configurations and frequency ranges. He identified a modified P250M Rusulka panoramic receiver, a sophisticated Soviet-manufactured device capable of simultaneously scanning entire frequency bands, and a workhorse of Soviet signals intelligence operations. Against the far wall, a substantial antenna array had been erected, its elements spanning from floor to ceiling. However, its configuration deviated from traditional designs. Thin-wire antennas were strung in a zigzag pattern across the ceiling and discreetly integrated into the curtains near the windows, rendering them virtually imperceptible unless one knew precisely what to look for. These wires were linked to multiple receivers via an intricate switching system that facilitated rapid retuning across different frequency bands. Adjacent to this, a desk displayed what appeared to be analysis equipment, oscilloscopes, signal strength meters, and frequency counters, all arranged in a manner indicative of professional intelligence work rather than amateur radio operations. The most significant discovery, however, was made in the bedroom, which had been transformed into what intelligence professionals would recognize as a documentation and transmission center. A typewriter rested on a desk surrounded by meticulously organized stacks of paper, many adorned with handwritten notes in what appeared to be Russian. A microfiche reader occupied another corner, suggesting that the operator of this facility also analyzed physical documents. Most damningly, an R394km burst transmitter was positioned on a table near the window, its attached wire antenna carefully oriented. This device, known within Soviet intelligence circles as Star-E, or SWIFT, was engineered to record messages, compress them into millisecond data bursts, and transmit them on high-frequency bands and pulses so brief as to be nearly undetectable and impossible to triangulate. It represented some of the most advanced Soviet communications tradecraft available in 1982. Frank maintained a watch at the door, while Michael and Carl worked with haste. They had established a maximum time limit of 10 minutes inside the apartment, sufficient for comprehensive documentation, but brief enough to minimize the risk of discovery. Carl exposed 3 rolls of film, capturing wide-angle views of the room, close-ups of specific equipment, and detailed shots of labels and model numbers. Michael jotted down notes on a small pad, recording technical specifications and configurations that would be unintelligible to most, but would provide intelligence analysts with a precise understanding of this listening post capabilities. At the 8-minute mark, a sound caused everyone to freeze. Footsteps in the hallway. Frank gestured frantically. Carl swiftly retracted his camera's flash unit, and Michael shoved his notepad into his pocket. They moved toward the door, prepared to account for their presence if necessary. The footsteps receded, continuing down the corridor towards another apartment. They waited 30 seconds, listening intently, before Frank made the decision to depart. They had secured what they came for. Any further time inside would exponentially increase their risk. They exited the apartment precisely as they had found it, carefully closing the door and ensuring the lock engaged correctly. The entire operation had lasted 9 minutes and 43 seconds. They dispersed immediately, Carl heading to his apartment with the film, Michael returning to his unit to secure his notes, and Frank making a pretense of inspecting other apartments on the floor, seemingly carrying out the electrical check that served as his cover. In Margaret Chen's apartment, the group reconvened 20 minutes later. Carl had already processed the first roll of film in his makeshift darkroom, and the images were spread across Margaret's dining table. The evidence was incontrovertible. Apartment 4F was a sophisticated Soviet signals intelligence facility, outfitted to intercept government communications, process and analyze the intercepted material, and transmit the findings. The immediate question was how to proceed with this evidence. They had acquired it through an unlawful entry, potentially rendering it inadmissible in any legal proceedings. However, they had also documented an active espionage operation, posing a significant threat to national security. The group engaged in a debate for another hour, proposing and rejecting various courses of action. Finally, Robert Harrison made a decisive resolution. He would personally deliver the photographs and technical notes directly to FBI headquarters the following morning, bypassing the Washington field office that had been slow to respond. He intended to insist on a meeting with a senior official in the counterintelligence division and would not depart until he had presented the evidence and secured assurances of immediate action. He resolved that if the FBI were to arrest him for illegal entry, so be it. At the very least, the espionage operation would be dismantled. The gathering concluded shortly before 10 p.m., with a mutual understanding to maintain discretion regarding their actions, until Robert provided an update on the FBI's reaction. They had overstepped, engaging in conduct that carried significant legal ramifications, yet they also felt they had fulfilled their civic obligation to safeguard national security. The night was restless for all of them, having taken matters into their own hands when official avenues failed to elicit a timely response. Robert Harrison arrived at FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue at 8:30 a.m. on April 8th, bearing a folder that contained Carl Winter's photographs and Michael Chen's technical specifications. He specifically requested an audience with the Soviet Counterintelligence Division and remained until his request was granted. The ensuing events defied his expectations. Within a mere 15 minutes, he was escorted not to a standard conference room, but to a secure office on an upper level. 2 special agents awaited him, their demeanor decidedly unwelcoming. They scrutinized the photographs, their expressions transitioning from doubt to apprehension, and promptly commenced a barrage of detailed inquiries concerning the origin of the images, any accomplices involved, and any items the residents might have handled or disturbed within the apartment. The questions grew increasingly pointed, and a growing sense of unease washed over Robert. He realized he was not perceived as a cooperative citizen, but as a potential security threat. He was then moved to a different room, devoid of windows and a clock, where the interrogation continued. Various agents took turns posing the same questions in different guises, seeking any discrepancies in his account. They delved into his background, his security clearances at the State Department, his interactions with foreign nationals, and even his personal finances. It gradually became apparent to Robert that the FBI was assessing whether he might be a double agent, or if the photographs and information were intended as disinformation to derail a legitimate investigation or to protect other Soviet operations by sacrificing this one. Hours elapsed. Robert had no means of gauging the duration of his confinement, though he estimated it was mid-afternoon based on his hunger. Eventually, Special Agent Mitchell entered the room, his expression somber. He informed Robert that the FBI was initiating an immediate operation at apartment 4F, confirming that all his reported information was being taken seriously. However, he cautioned that Robert and the other residents might have jeopardized an investigation that had been underway for months. The Bureau had not been idle. They had been meticulously documenting the network, identifying additional operational hubs, and awaiting a planned rendezvous between the 4F operatives and their handler. That meeting, Mitchell explained, would now never transpire, as the Soviets would inevitably realize their facility had been compromised. Mitchell made it clear that Robert would remain in FBI custody until the raid concluded and the situation was fully secured. This was not an arrest, but it was not a request. Robert remained in that windowless room for what felt like an eternity, oscillating between a sense of pride for their initiative and a gnawing dread that they had exacerbated the situation. It was 5:47 p.m. when Mitchell returned and informed Robert he was free to leave. The operation at 1847 16th Street Northwest had been successfully executed. The seized equipment was being transported to FBI laboratories. The building's residents were permitted to return to their homes. Robert was released with a stern admonition regarding civilian interference in federal investigations. David Thorne was never apprehended. A nationwide search yielded no results, and it eventually became clear that David Thorne was a fabricated persona, an alias created by Soviet intelligence specifically for this operation. The actual operators of the listening post had departed the country within 48 hours of the threatening phone call to Dorothy Patterson, apparently alerted by their own surveillance that the residents' activities had intensified and that American counterintelligence forces were likely closing in. The FBI would later ascertain that at least 3 Soviet intelligence officers had operated from apartment 4F in rotating shifts, arriving and departing at different times to maintain the facade of a single, reclusive tenant. The subsequent investigation unveiled the full extent of the clandestine activities. The listening post had been targeting U.S. government communications, employing sophisticated interception equipment capable of monitoring both wired telephone lines and radio frequencies. The operation had proven notably effective at intercepting communications from mid-level officials who handled classified information, but who did not always adhere to proper security protocols when discussing work-related matters from home or via unsecured lines. The residents who had conducted the unauthorized entry were extensively interviewed by the FBI in the days that followed. The Bureau expressed its displeasure with their actions, emphasizing that civilian interference in counterintelligence operations was both perilous and unlawful, although ultimately no charges were filed. The evidence they had obtained was not utilized in any legal proceedings, but their tenacity had compelled the situation toward a resolution, albeit one that came at a price. The residents had not fully grasped the complexities involved. Their experience left them with a mixture of emotions. They had been validated in their suspicions, and their actions had ultimately led to the dismantling of a significant Soviet intelligence operation. However, they also learned a harsh lesson. Espionage was far more intricate than it appeared from the outside. The FBI's delayed response was not indicative of bureaucratic incompetence, but rather a calculated counterintelligence strategy that they as civilians had failed to comprehend. Margaret Chen relocated from 1847 16th Street NW 6 months later, finding the building too burdened with the unsettling memories. The other residents gradually moved away as well, and by 1985, none of the original group remained. Apartment 4F was eventually leased without incident to a succession of ordinary tenants who remained oblivious to its clandestine former life. The Cold War was waged in the shadows by professionals skilled in the art of deception. Yet, it was also sometimes fought, unknowingly, by ordinary individuals caught between conflicting interpretations of duty. The residents of 1847 16th Street NW were not intelligence officers or counter-espionage specialists. They were librarians and attorneys, engineers and editors, people who paid their rent, went to work, and happened to notice that something was amiss in their building. They risked and contravened the law in pursuit of what they believed was a higher calling.